Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into a topic that's surprisingly common in the pipeline world.
Yeah.
Ground movement. You might picture, dramatic landslides wiping out mountain pipelines. The reality is far more subtle and widespread.
Yeah.
Even small shifts in the soil can spell big trouble for pipeline integrity.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about those crucial gathering lines in the upstream oil and gas sector.
That's right. It is a bit of a hidden threat.
Yeah.
We often focus on the pipeline itself. Corrosion cracks the materials, but the ground beneath those pipes is constantly changing and adapting.
Yeah.
And in upstream environments where you have these networks of smaller gathering pipelines crisscrossing often hilly terrain, well, understanding ground movement becomes crucial.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about catastrophic landslides here, right?
Right.
What kind of ground movement are we dealing with, and why is it such a big deal for these gathering pipelines specifically?
You've hit the nail on the head. It's the subtle shifts that often go unnoticed.
Yeah.
Those slow creeps or small slumps that can gradually stress a pipeline over time. Gathering lines, unlike those large transmission pipelines, tend to be thinner, operate at lower pressures, and are often laid in shallower trenches. This makes them particularly vulnerable to even minor ground movement.
So it's almost like a slow motion threat.
Yeah.
Something that builds up over time and can catch you off guard if you're not paying attention.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to shift our thinking from reacting to incidents to proactively managing the risks. It's not just about fixing a leak after it happens. It's about understanding the ground, identifying potential problem areas, and implementing strategies to mitigate those risks before they become incidents.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But here's what I'm wondering.
Sure.
How do we even begin to assess this risk when ground movement is so unpredictable and varies so much from place to place? It feels a bit like trying to predict the weather, doesn't it?
It does, and that's where the real challenge lies.
Yeah.
We can't simply rely on visual inspections or traditional pipeline monitoring techniques.
Right.
We need a more nuanced understanding of the factors that contribute to ground instability. This means looking at the soil composition, the topography, rainfall patterns, even things like vegetation cover. Well, it's not a one-size-fits-all formula. Every pipeline system is unique. And the risk factors can vary depending on the location, the terrain, the type of soil, and even the history of ground movement in the area.
So it's a pretty localized assessment then.
Yeah.
We're not just relying on some generic industry-wide standards.
That's right. While there are general guidelines and best practices, the real power lies in tailoring the assessment to the specific pipeline system and its surrounding environment.
Right.
It's about gathering the right data, analyzing it carefully, and then using that knowledge to make informed decisions about how to manage the risk.
Okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
It's not just about the pipeline itself. It's about understanding the entire system.
Right.
The ground, the environment, and how all these factors interact to influence risk.
Absolutely. It's about taking a holistic view and recognizing that ground movement is not just an isolated event, but part of a complex and interconnected system.
Right.
And as we delve deeper into this topic, you'll see just how fascinating and important this interplay between the pipeline and its surrounding environment really is.
This is already getting super interesting.
Yeah.
So we've established that understanding ground movement and classifying risk is crucial, especially for these upstream gathering lines.
Right.
But how do we actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
What kind of tools and techniques are available to help us gather the data, analyze the risk, and implement effective mitigation strategies?
We start with broad assessments and then progressively narrow our focus based on the level of risk we identify.
Okay, that makes sense. Kind of like a funnel starting wide and then getting more specific as we go.
Exactly. And one of the first steps in this funnel is gathering data about the pipeline's surrounding environment. Think of it like creating a map of potential hazards.
So what kind of data are we talking about here? What are those initial clues we're looking for?
We can start with readily available information like geological maps and soil surveys. These can tell us a lot about the underlying geology, the types of soil present, and even historical patterns of ground movement in the area.
That's a great starting point. But I imagine we need more than just maps and surveys to really understand the nuances of ground movement.
You're right. To get a clearer picture, we can turn to remote sensing technologies like LIDAR and aerial photography. These tools allow us to create detailed 3D models of the terrain identify areas of steep slopes or erosion, and even detect subtle changes in vegetation patterns that might indicate underlying ground movement.
Wow. It's amazing how technology can give us such a bird's-eye view of the landscape. But what about those underground mysteries, the things we can't see from the surface?
That's where geotechnical investigations come in. Think of these as the ground truthing phase.
Okay.
We might drill boreholes to collect soil samples, conduct in situ tests to measure soil strength and moisture content, or even use geophysical techniques to image the subsurface layers.
So it's like sending in the ground troops to gather intel on what's happening beneath the surface.
Precisely. And all this data from the maps and remote sensing to the geotechnical investigations starts to paint a picture of the ground conditions along the pipeline route.
Okay, so we've gathered all this information. We have our maps, our aerial images, our soil samples. Now, how do we actually turn this data into actionable insights? How do we actually classify the risk for each pipeline segment?
That's where the analysis comes in.
Okay.
We take all this data and feed it into models and algorithms that help us assess the likelihood and potential severity of ground movement. We consider factors like slope stability, soil properties, rainfall patterns, and even the pipeline's characteristics like its diameter, material, and burial depth.
So we're essentially creating a risk profile for each section of the pipeline based on all these different factors.
Exactly. And this risk profile then guides our decision-making process. We might decide that some areas are low risk and require only routine monitoring. Other areas might be classified as medium risk, requiring more frequent inspections or even some preventative measures. And those high-risk zones might warrant continuous monitoring, proactive mitigation strategies, or even pipeline rerouting in extreme cases.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see how ground movement management is really a multidisciplinary field, blending elements of geotechnical engineering, remote sensing data analytics, and good old-fashioned engineering judgment. But I'm wondering, what about the actual mitigation strategies? What are some of the things we can do to proactively reduce the risk of ground movement impacting these pipelines?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The mitigation strategies we employ can range from simple and low-tech to quite sophisticated depending on the level of risk and the specific site conditions.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly.
We're tailoring the solution to the problem.
For instance, in areas where we've identified a moderate risk of shallow soil movement, something as straightforward as improving drainage can be surprisingly effective.
Okay.
By managing water runoff and preventing soil saturation, we can often significantly reduce the likelihood of those small slumps and slides that can stress a pipeline.
It's amazing how something as simple as water management can play such a crucial role. It's a reminder that sometimes the most elegant solutions are the ones that work with nature, not against it.
Absolutely. But of course, there are situations where we need to implement more robust measures. In areas prone to deeper landslides or where the soil is inherently unstable, we might need to consider slope stabilization techniques.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What are some of the tools in our slope stabilization toolbox?
One common approach is to reinforce the slope with retaining walls or soil nails.
Okay.
These structures act like anchors, literally holding the soil back and preventing it from moving downslope. We might also use geotextiles, which are basically synthetic fabrics that provide additional strength and stability to the soil mass.
So it's like giving the hillside a supportive hug to keep it from slipping away. I imagine these techniques are especially important in steep terrain where the force of gravity is really working against us.
Precisely. And in some cases, especially when dealing with highly unstable slopes or areas where the pipeline might be particularly vulnerable, we might even consider rerouting the pipeline altogether.
Wow, so we're talking about potentially moving the pipeline to a more stable location. That sounds like a pretty significant undertaking.
It can be, but sometimes it's the safest and most cost-effective solution in the long run. Remember, preventing a pipeline incident is always preferable to dealing with the consequences of a failure.
That's a really important point. It's about taking a proactive approach, investing in prevention, rather than reacting to problems after they occur.
And as technology continues to advance, we're seeing even more innovative mitigation strategies emerging. For example, some operators are now experimenting with ground improvement techniques that actually alter the soil properties to make it more stable.
It sounds almost like science fiction being able to change the very nature of the ground itself. How does that work?
Well, there are various techniques, but one example is deep soil mixing. This involves injecting a special grout mixture into the ground, which then solidifies and creates a more stable foundation. It's like turning loose soil into a solid mass, almost like concrete.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. It sounds like we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible when it comes to ground movement mitigation.
We are, and it's exciting to see how these advancements are helping us reduce the risk of pipeline incidents and protect the environment.
Absolutely. So we've covered a wide range of mitigation strategies.
Yeah.
From simple drainage improvements to high-tech ground modification techniques. It's clear that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and the best approach depends on a variety of factors.
Right.
But I think the key takeaway here is that by carefully assessing risk, proactively monitoring ground conditions,
Right.
and implementing appropriate mitigation measures, we can significantly reduce the likelihood of ground movement impacting those crucial gathering pipelines.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's all about taking that proactive, holistic approach, understanding the ground, respecting its dynamics, and working with nature to ensure the safe and sustainable operation of our pipeline infrastructure.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of ground movement and pipeline safety. I think I can speak for both of us when I say it's been a fascinating journey, revealing the hidden complexities beneath our feet and showcasing the innovative ways we're working to ensure the integrity of these critical energy lifelines.
Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about the complex world beneath our feet, the better equipped we are to protect our environment, our communities, and the critical infrastructure that sustains our modern world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep digging deep.